if you guys could please help me in welcoming Tracy Baim.
Thank you, thank you. Thanks for having me today. It's going to be a big month next month. There are so many things happening around Chicago. I was very tempted to go to New York City because it's Stonewall 50 in New York City, and I was at Stonewall 25, and that was a phenomenal experience. And so if you get a chance or you have friends in the East Coast, there are hundreds and hundreds of different events happening in New York City, including multiple different pride parades, because of course there's controversy within the LGBT community. We can't have just one march. So my work in LGBT media coincided with my graduation from college. I grew up, born and raised in Chicago and from a journalism family. And when I graduated from Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa in 1984, there were really just a handful of openly gay people working in journalism in the United States. I only know of one. People have told me there were a few others, but Randy Schultz from San Francisco was the only one that I was aware of. And I didn't know there was a thing such as the gay press. I did know there was a feminist press, and I thought, well, maybe I could work for Ms. Magazine as an openly lesbian person. But I really didn't realize how bad it was to be an openly gay journalist. I was very fortunate that my mother had known that there was a gay newspaper in Chicago. So when I came back within a month, I had interviewed at Gay Life newspaper and I knew how to run the typesetting equipment. I knew how to take photos. I knew how to do layout. And I actually had a journalism degree, which was kind of rare in the gay press back then, because if you had a journalism degree, you would not work in the gay press if you wanted to have a career. So I was lucky enough to get that job and have been in the gay press ever since, and really have no regrets about it. Many of my friends that were in journalism in the 80s got out of it anyway because the pay sucks. And if you're trying to raise a family and do other kinds of things, it was hard to do. And being a woman journalist was hard enough. Being people of color journalists, being LGBT journalists, all those things were not easy back then, and they're not easy now. So I feel very lucky for 35 years now. I just celebrated my 35th anniversary last week at a party at Sidetrack. It was unbelievably fantastic. A couple hundred people that I've known, many of them for my whole 35 years in LGBT community in Chicago. But it was also kind of sad because I put together a slideshow of about 950 photos. I have 1 million documents, and I pulled 950 of them and put them on the screens. And so many of those people are no longer alive. And I think probably the reason I'm still doing what I'm doing is mostly because of when I started in gay press in 1984, basically coming into a war zone in the middle of a country that didn't think there was a war, didn't know there was a war, didn't care who was dying. And in Chicago, there were fewer than 100 cases of AIDS diagnosed at that point. In fact, AIDS had just been named a few months before I got my job. They had called it gay-related immune deficiency before then. And so in the window of time that I started working in gay media, I was covering funerals and marches and protests of people my age or just slightly older than me who were literally fighting for their lives against a system that was firing them, kicking them out of apartments. A partner would die and the family would come in and take everything and kick the partner out. All of this tragedy, including serial killers targeting the gay community and all sorts of things. But also what was happening parallel to that was this amazing resistance. It's very similar to what's happening now. We have kids in cages and people fighting back against an uncaring administration. We had Ronald Reagan, who didn't want to even utter the word AIDS as people around him were dying, friends of his like Rock Hudson. And we have a similar lack of empathy from the White House these days. So what carried it through was this resilience, was the community in 1980. So I started in 84. I co-founded Windy City Times in 85. And then so the fight for even basic access to anything was happening on AIDS. There were no drugs. There was nothing for another couple of years. ACT UP started a couple of years later. But there were people on the ground bringing meals to people who were sick, walking dogs of people who were sick, driving people to hospitals. It was an amazing show of strength of the community coming together. Lesbians and gay men who had been fighting throughout the 1970s found a way to work together in the 80s to combat this horrible disease. And at the same time say, fighting the disease is not enough. We got to fight for our rights. So in the 80s, the fight for gay rights in Chicago was at its peak and was successful by the end of the decade because people came out of the closets by the thousands. When I first started, there were probably 200 people that would have allowed their photo to be used in the paper with their real name. I didn't even realize I was working with reporters who weren't using their real names. They would leave the paper and then they'd say, well, Tracy, you can contact me here, and this is my real name. And I'd be like, wait a minute, I wasn't working with someone. I didn't even know the people's names that I worked with. It was just really weird. But at the same time, so people were fighting for their lives, and they were saying, and fighting for our lives is not enough. We're also going to get our gay rights. We're going to get all this other stuff. And ultimately, that led to where we're at today. It led to Lori Lightfoot being the mayor of Chicago. It led to marriage equality. There's no doubt we would have these things if the tragedy of the 80s didn't force tens of thousands, if not millions of people out of the closets, into the streets, fighting for their rights at corporations and other places, wherever they were forced to really confront that bigotry. So I feel really fortunate that my time was started during that time, because there were so many voices that weren't being written about, so many stories that weren't being told. We were writing, when I was in college, in journalism school, you do a test, you write your own obituary. It's very morbid, but you do. That's one of the tests. You write your obituary. And I thought, well, I don't want to write obituaries for a living. That would be, really, that would be the dredge of journalism, right? But I soon realized that it is the biggest honor of a journalist's life to be able to write a story about someone that's going to be their footprint in history. And, looking back at some of the stories, my bylines on this, I don't even remember writing the stories, but I remember the honor it was to do stories of the living while they were living and then tell their stories as they were dying. And it still happens today. I wrote an obituary a few weeks ago about a woman named Rala Klepek, who was a very strong ally of the community in the 1960s and 70s. And her family called and said she wanted you to write the obit. And two people last year who were dying called me in and said, Tracy, can you do my final interview? So of all the things I do, of course, over these 35 years, telling someone's story in 500 words or 2,000 words or whatever it is like the greatest honor. And it's the thing I thought I wouldn't want to do. So I'm kind of rambling a little bit. I want to answer questions you guys want to have. But this legacy we're at today is so easily tied to the passionate work of the people from the 80s. Some of them still with us today. I did a website called ChicagoGayHistory.org. If you care about kind of oral histories, under the biographies button, there's 200 oral histories I took down about 10 years ago. About 20 of those people have died since. But they're video oral histories, because I knew not everybody likes newsprint like I do. So I did all these oral histories to capture people telling their stories, and some of them from the 60s. And some of them are not with us anymore. They say journalism is the first draft of history, but in many cases, what we were doing was the only draft of history. So we can look back and see this stuff. I was so grateful that we've saved it. I'm a pack rat. I've turned over, like I said, over 1 million documents to the Chicago Public Library now. So they have all the originals of our newspapers, of our photos, of the press releases from ACT UP, and everything else I could cobble together. They have all the originals, and I've scanned over 1 million documents so that I have them as well available.
Wow.
Yeah.
On this topic of kind of like our history and looking back and being able to document that, you mentioned this before, this is the 50th year anniversary of the Stonewall riots. Can you talk about kind of what that means to you, what plans you have in terms of the media and the newspaper of communicating this to the public?
Yeah, certainly both at the Reader and Windy City Times, there's going to be a lot of coverage during that month. I don't think it's going to be, because there's so many other things happening, like books that are coming out. Like you can't match the work, the movies that are coming out, the books that are coming out, and the exhibits that are happening in New York City. And there's a great exhibit at Wrightwood 659 Gallery I would highly recommend. In Chicago, it's supposedly the largest collection of LGBT artists ever done. Not the number of artists, but the number of pieces. It's over 500 pieces of LGBTQ art. It's happening coinciding with Stonewall, but it predates and also postdates Stonewall. So it's not a Stonewall exhibit, but it's the largest collection ever in one place of art by LGBT people at Wrightwood 659 Gallery on the north side. we don't have as many things going on in Chicago as New York's having. So we're going to have certainly some coverage and some retrospectives. We're going to do a button collection pullout, both in Windy City and the Reader as a collector's item of some buttons from the 60s to today. And we're going to honor some of the people that were around either right prior to Stonewall or current to right after Stonewall. Chicago was interesting in the response to Stonewall. At the time, there was a newsletter called Mattachine Midwest had a newsletter. So a month after the Stonewall riots, they had this little item that there was, gay people fighting back at this bar called Stonewall in New York City. For the most part, Stonewall didn't really enter the consciousness of the country in any really big way until a little while after it happened. And Chicago, the April after the Stonewall riots happened, late June of '69, so the April 1970, there was a tax day protest in Chicago. So on April 15th, gay people were protesting that here we pay taxes, but we don't get equal benefits. And so that was kind of one of the first public events that happened in Chicago. But prior to Stonewall, there had been people fighting back. They were fighting against police brutality. They were fighting against police harassment of the gay bars. The police would go in and raid gay bars, and they still did it actually until the mid-1980s. But in the 1950s and 60s in particular, there were these really high-profile raids of gay bars. And the Chicago Tribune and the Sun-Times and other papers, they would print the names of the people arrested. People would commit suicide. They would get divorces out of it. They would lose custody of children. They absolutely lost their jobs. A lot of teachers lost their jobs. And it was brutal. And so the gay community was fighting back prior to Stonewall in Chicago. There was a really high-profile raid of a bar called The Trip in 1968, prior to the Democratic National Convention here. A lot of times, the raids would happen around elections, like a short time before elections, to show that they were fighting sin. And the gay people fought against that. And the attorney I just mentioned, who passed away a couple weeks ago, she was the one who fought it to the state Supreme Court and won against what had happened. So they were primed. The community here was primed for then the post-Stonewall era. So on the anniversary of Stonewall in 1970, Chicago and two other cities, it was probably LA and New York, were the first to actually hold a commemoration event to mark Stonewall. So it was a march downtown, starting at Bughouse Square, which is by the Newberry Library, downtown. And then for a few years, it was mainly a march, a protest march. And then it eventually evolved into a parade. So when I started in '84, by then it was a parade in Lakeview. It happened along Broadway. And I remember sitting atop a business on Broadway and Diversey, taking photos down at my very first Pride Parade. It was unbelievable to see. I don't even think they blocked traffic on the whole street. I think they made the parade go down one side of the street and cars were still going down the other side of the street. I mean, it was a lot different. There were maybe, I think, 50 or 60,000 people the first year I covered it. The Pride Parade had really grown. By the late 70s, what happened, Anita Bryant, anybody in here heard of Anita Bryant? Very homophobic Christian lady who was fighting against gay rights in Florida. Well, she was doing a tour in the late 70s. I think around 1978, she came to Chicago to be at Medina Temple. And the gay community organized, it was early June, so the gay community organized and stood around the whole temple to protest her event. Well, it happened to be just a couple weeks short of Pride. So that year's Pride Parade had a huge boost in attendance. And Harvey Milk was out by then, running in San Francisco. So by the late 70s, the Pride Parade really became a significant force in Chicago. Obviously now it's 1 million people. But so when I covered it by '84, '85, it was in the tens of thousands of people.
Wow. And speaking of Windy City Times, like, you were able to kind of create this newspaper and this channel for information kind of from scratch. Can you talk a little bit about the biggest obstacles that you faced when starting this and kind of bringing this up and making it public? And for example, whether it came to hiring people, what obstacles are you currently facing now? How has Windy City Times kind of changed from when you created it to where it is now?
Well, the only similarity is it's always desperate for money. It's always been hard to do. Today, the competitors are sitting in this room, Google and Facebook and others. But back then, the competitors were homophobia and transphobia and corporations and companies that didn't want to be seen as supportive. So there's always been obstacles. So I was at Gay Life newspaper for a year, From 84 to mid 85, I moved up from editorial assistant to managing editor in a year because nobody wanted the job and it was horrible pay. But I loved it. I loved every second of it. If I had to deliver the paper, I did. Every part of it, I loved. But the owner of the paper, a man named Chuck Renslow, who I ended up staying friends with till he passed away a couple years ago, but his lover actually spoke at my thing last week saying that how close Chuck and I were. But back then, Chuck's reputation was such that he owned a leather bar, he owned the bathhouse that was next door to the newspaper, he owned the newspaper, he was very active in Democratic politics, he had run for Kennedy delegate at the Democratic National Convention. He was very connected in every which way, and people thought that because he had too much power. They thought he controlled too much in the community, and as the AIDS crisis was happening, you have a bathhouse owner who owns a newspaper. And Ken, you expected to be fair. And I never was censored by him. I loved him and I loved working for him. But unfortunately, the community perception was real. And I actually covered in his own paper the controversy about him owning the newspaper. He let me do that on the cover. But it became too intense. And so in mid 1985, a guy who worked there, Bob Bearden, his partner made a bid to buy Gay Life and then reneged on the bid and ended up starting Windy City Times and asked me to be the founding managing editor. So the four people left and started it, and then being able to get people to write and work for it, there was enough people that wanted to help, right? So yes, some people used pseudonyms, many people used pseudonyms, but many other people, just didn't care, especially people who were, we had our travel writer, he got diagnosed with AIDS and died in a week from diagnosis. Bob Bearden, one of the co-founders, within 4 weeks of us starting Windy City Times, he got diagnosed. And we were actually doing the paper out of his apartment on Melrose Avenue. And my partner at the time was a nurse, and she would get him aspirin. I mean, there was nothing for him. And so it was this moment of desperation and knowing that there was no internet. There was no other way to communicate that there was a protest coming. Well, there were phone trees. People would call and have phone trees to tell people where to show up. But the newspaper was the way. We printed all the politicians' phone numbers, and we printed, where the gatherings were, where the events were. And so there was definitely this urgency of information sharing that was just critical. And so it was hard, but it was not. It was like a no regret situation. Like, you will do 23 hours a day if that's what it takes to get this done. And there were a lot of people that were attracted to that.
And how would you say it is now? So you go from this time where this is the source of truth and we're kind of starting from the ground up. You're working in someone's apartment. What is the Windy City Times like right now?
So the Windy City Times now is in people's apartments because we're a virtual office. Because right before the economy collapsed in 2008, we were lucky enough to have already been planning to go to a virtual office, and it was the only reason we survived the crash of the economy, because advertising dropped for a couple of years there, and some categories never came back. So our whole team works from home, and the paper itself is still physical. Paper, 10,000 copies we print, and it's always been a struggle, but it's partly because I'm a journalist and not a business person, and probably has no business at running a newspaper. But we have such amazing people that put it together. Like I was telling you before, that we only have a small team, but most of them have been there 20 years or more.
Yeah.
And I have writers that have written for me for 30 plus years, and delivery drivers. One of the hardest things to get. We have drivers that have driven it for us just one day a week to deliver the papers for 15 years. So, it's still a struggle. In fact, last week's event was a fundraiser for the Windy City Times. I did it. Friends hosted it as a 35th anniversary for me, but it was a benefit for the Windy City Times. So we're not sure what the future holds. One of the reasons I took the job last fall at the Chicago Reader is I've had a lot of things I've wanted to do in local community and ethnic media, and bringing us together to work together. And being at the Reader is a larger platform for me. It's a mainstream alternative weekly newspaper founded in 1971. It has if you're not from Chicago, it has a really great reputation of being this alt weekly that fights the power. And great culture coverage, great politics coverage, great reputation, but it was dying. It literally was one 24-hour period away from being shut down. And the Writers Union reached out to me and said, Tracy, would you take it on? And I said, I can work there, but I can't fund it.
Yeah.
So they got the funders and they hired me. And now what I'm trying to do is work with other community and ethnic media, La Raza and Crusader and other papers to say, hey, can we work together to work on joint advertising projects or events or membership campaigns? The Reader did its first ever membership campaign earlier this year and raised $130,000 from 2,400 people to keep the Reader alive. So there's support for community media out there. We just have to find those people, and there's companies who want to be there. And that's my real job at the Reader, is trying to figure out new revenue, new ways of doing things. And I'm hoping that then it'll lift all boats, including Windy City Times.
And do you think Chicago itself, you said it was like kind of conducive, it was a good like pilot city to do that. What have you found in terms of the LGBT community in Chicago in particular that like you don't find in other cities? Is there something that has kept you drawn here, besides obviously growing up here, but something that has kept you in Chicago, supporting the communities in Chicago, whether it be LGBTQ or other minority communities?
Well, one thing I would say is that I don't see the community through rose-colored glasses or lavender-colored at all. I see all the bad. I cover the bad. I've covered the scandals. There's not one LGBT organization that Windy City Times has not had to cover their bad stuff. But I also see the good stuff. And the good stuff outweighs it for me. And because I don't have this like Pollyannish view of any community, every community has bad people, infighting, murderers, drug dealers, and wonderful, passionate volunteers that do amazing stuff to lift that community up. So I have a great view of it. You know, it's not skewed one way or the other, so that when I've been burned within the community, and I can move to another part of the community and feel still motivated to do the work. I was one of the 4 co-leaders of the Gay Games when it came to Chicago in 2006, and that was a brutal 7-year volunteering effort for me. And I would never do it again, but I don't regret doing it. But it was really hard because the community was being sabotaged from within. People were fighting each other. A lot of people were afraid of the risk of doing such a big event. There was 12,000 athletes from 70 countries around the world, all done by mostly volunteers and a few key staff. And it was crazy to think we could do it. And we did it, and we broke even, which was even, no other gay games since the first couple had broken even. So I knew we could do it because I knew we had the good and the bad. I wasn't going to see it as without bumps. Okay. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your questions, but I feel like that perspective helps. And a lot of people they see one little part of the community, whether that's one group or one person. And when that group or person lets you down, people leave the community. And it's very sad. I know people that have left Chicago because they've had a bad experience with one part of the community or whatever it might be. And I know that there's the good. I know that there's so many people doing good, even if some don't.
Right. I think, especially here at Google, one of the things we really value is mentorship. Mentorship, whether it be career development, whether it be kind of on things that you're passionate about. Throughout your career, have you kind of had this person, this mentor that you've leaned on, that's been a voice of reason, someone to go to for advice?
Early on, when I was 21 or 22 years old, looking back, I cannot believe how many older LGBT people were gracious with their time and their money. So in 1987, I left Windy City Times. I can't really say some of the things that the co-owner did, even though he's passed away. I don't want to say it in a public venue, but it was just very discouraging. Once Bob died, he did die about a year later, his surviving partner was untenable for me. I could not work with him at all. He had no journalism experience and he had lots of bad habits. Leave it there. So I left and started another paper when I was 20, I guess that would have been 24 years old. People in the community gave me $200,000 to do it. Like, I don't know if I could do that to a 24-year-old starting a newspaper. I couldn't financially, but even if I had it, I'd be like, well, how do you think you're going to run it? Well, they all believed me, and they never made their money back. In fact, last year, they all turned their shares in and said, Tracy, it's yours. So now I own 90% of the paper. I didn't own nearly, I owned 50% of it over the years as people turned in their shares, and now I own 90% of the company. Like hot potato, here, you can have it. But they just believed in me, right? They believed in the mission and they believed in the community. And so I couldn't even list the number of older as well as similar aged people over time who've who've trusted in me, believed in me in whatever way that was, sometimes financially and sometimes otherwise, just take me out to lunch when I couldn't afford a meal, kind of stuff. And now I feel mentored by the younger people, right? Like, so I've done a lot of work on youth homelessness in Chicago. And I literally can I read you a text I just got from this young woman for years. She helped me on a youth homeless summit a few years ago. She read this poem at the summit that turned into something called the Chicago Youth Storage Initiative. Her name's Breezy. She read this poem at our summit, and it so profoundly affected the funders there. They literally turned around the next week, called me and said, we want to found an organization that's going to put lockers into shelters because of her poem about the choice people make as homeless people between belongings. It was unbelievable. So today I get a text from her, and she goes, she wanted to come back from Minnesota this summer to volunteer for me to do anything. And she goes, you have helped me out so much. I just want to repay you somehow. I call you my godmom, and I think my duty as your goddaughter is to check on you and help you whenever you need help. I literally got that a couple hours ago on the way here. And there's another youth I might give her $20 for transit to a job interview or something once in a while. But what she gives me back is so much more than money is. And so I not only feel like I'm paying it forward, but I'm continually getting like benefits from the work that I do, and how rewarding it is. It has nothing to do with money.
Yeah, that's awesome. Those are all the questions that I have. So I think we can go to our Dory, where we have some questions.
Hey, Dory.
Let's start with the first one. Can you tell us or elaborate on a time where you took a huge risk, both professionally and or personally?
I think breaking off of Windy City Times was really the biggest risk I ever took. And 13 years later, I bought it back from my co-founder. I got it out of foster care, and I got it back. And I am the luckiest person in the world to have made that change and started my own thing on my own, away from the other thing I co-founded, and then be able to get that back in the fold in 2000 was unbelievable. But second thing I did was in 2013, when marriage equality was being debated in our state capitol in Springfield. I was down there during the last days of session, which are May. Our session ends here May 31st. So I was down there the last few days, and the marriage equality vote was expected to come up. But a lot of the insider activists, they did an insider game, and I'd seen that fail many times before. If you don't have an outside game and an inside game, complementing one another and pressuring the legislators, they're not going to do anything. And that's exactly what happened. So I was in Springfield in a rainstorm that night, and as before we left back for Chicago, I wrote this scathing editorial saying, this is ridiculous. How come there weren't 10,000 people in Springfield fighting for that vote? It would have happened. I think it would have happened. So it was really, I raked over the coals Greg Harris, who's a state representative, openly gay. And he and I have gone way back. In fact, last week I found this amazing photo of him with the big bare chest, with the leather chaps on that I had at my party, and people could not even believe it. But he and I go way back. I knew he'd take it professionally. My role as a journalist, his role as a legislator. Mm-hmm. He's still getting paid. But on social media, it became the Greg versus Tracy show. Mm. And I was like, shit, this is horrible. It's not about me, and it's not about him. It's about the bill. So it was like 4 days of utter hell on social media. And I called Greg, and I said, Greg, can we have a non-beer summit? Because neither of us drink. Let's just talk. And I went into his office. I said, Greg, if 10,000 people had showed up on Springfield on May 31st, would the vote have happened? He goes, probably. I said, okay, I'm going to take you for your word. So there's a what's called it's a session in the fall. It's called the veto session. So that fall, I was motivated because I didn't want to wait for another whole year, because I had friends who were dying, friends whose partners were dying, and they needed those benefits that year, not another delay. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to take you at your word. So I asked every single gay organization in town to work with me, and Windy Times would do a march on Springfield for marriage equality. Everybody told me no. Wow. Everybody. Now, some people behind the scenes said, you go for it, Tracy. I'll support you. And in the next month or two, I'll probably be able to get my organization on your side. But I can't tell you that right now. It was June. Mm-hmm. Pride Month. I'm like, we have Pride Parade. We can promote it. It had to be in the fall. Yeah. So we had 4 months to promote it. I'm sorry, I'm a little insider baseball here, but it was an amazing experience because everybody said, no, it can't be done. Gay people won't go to Springfield. Gay people don't march for their rights. They all told me this, and it never had happened before. And I'm like, I think we can do it. So I spent 4 months traveling across the state. I recruited 13 co-chairs with me that were from all different parts of the state and all different parts of the city of Chicago. And I'd go meet with them in their communities. We'd rally the troops. I met with churches and synagogues and mosques. I met with anybody who would meet with me for 4 months. And, had banners. I raised $40,000 from friends. Meanwhile, the other group that's working on the inside raised $2 million for lobbyists. Okay. That's their game. That's okay. I raised $40,000, most of that just to cover the stage, speakers, and porta potties for the march. So October 22nd, 2013, we're in the session. Luckily, we timed it well because sometimes they cancel dates in the fall. They don't hardly meet. So we got a date. They were in session. It was the middle of the week. People took off work. We had over 5,000 people came to Springfield. And it was pouring rain and cold. We had 4 hours of programming so that people could go inside lobby, come back out. It was live streamed all over so people could call their legislators. We had all the information. I think like 15, 20,000 people were watching it live. And the vote happened a few days later. Did it even happen the next day? I don't even remember. But it happened that session. It passed. It wasn't going to go into effect till the next July 1st, but that wasn't the point. The point was, parallel to that, Lambda Legal and the ACLU had court cases pending. As soon as the law passed, the judges started to allow people to get married. Within a week of it being passed, people were getting married who had medical reasons to get married and would die a few weeks later. It was unbelievable how quick then that things changed in Illinois for people for the better. And it's because we had the outside game that complemented the inside game that was both of them necessary. But it was a huge risk for me to say I can get thousands of people to Springfield, Illinois in the middle of a workday in October.
Yeah.
And so it's the proudest achievement of my life because everybody told me no. Gay Games was really hard, but there was a whole group of people that were pushing against the naysayers. For me, it was like, at the start, I was like, oh my God, I just told Greg Harris I could get thousands of people. The organizing group, Equality Illinois, who I love their executive director now, but back then, they got the last day of session, they couldn't even fill one bus from Chicago because they tried it the day before. They started calling people. I saw them on the phone. Okay, we got to get a bus. I'm like, the vote could be in less than 24 hours and you're now organizing a bus? My dad met the bus because he's a photographer. It wasn't even full in Chicago. It was sad, pathetic insider baseball that did not work. And so anyway, that was a really long story, but it was very fun to do. And sometimes as a journalist, I felt like I wrote this editorial. I had to put up or shut up. I wrote an editorial attacking people for not doing what I thought was possible. They told me it wasn't possible, so I had to do what I said I thought this community could do, because I know this community at its core, and I know it will show up at times like that.
That's amazing. Well, congratulations and thank you. I mean, those are the types of things that we are so thankful for in our community, for leaders like you who risk that and are able to put themselves out there for things like this. So thank you. Our next question. Have you seen digital channels change the way that underrepresented groups break into journalism and media?
1,000%. I would say that, when my mother was a journalist, and she was very frustrated by the sexism in the industry. She started in the 60s. Every generation has seen another opening of the tools of journalism so that then the access becomes more equalized. The problem is the resources are unevenly distributed. So yes, of course you can be a blogger or a video blogger or whatever. You can do all those things now. So the access is there. But the ability to get your word out in any significant, consistent way and make a living at it, that's the hard part.
Yeah.
And that's where I think I would like technology companies to figure out a way to partner with legacy media like Facebook is doing with their local news initiative. Google could be doing that with their AdWords and ad things in a more significant way to lift up the voices of diverse communities. And I'd love to talk with people about that because there's an endless amount of possible partnerships out there, but it's a doable situation to be able to partner together the legacy and the the new voices out there with the technology companies. So it's changed immensely, and just even doing a newspaper in 1984 was tremendously easier than doing it 10 years prior to that, and 10 years prior to that. Every generation, especially by the 80s when you had computer, refrigerator-sized typesetting machines, that was a huge advance over the hot lead linotype machines, which I had used in high school and have lead burns to prove it. I mean, it's just really accelerated since the 70s to today. So I love it. We use all those tools. We are available any which way people want to find us. We've always been free. So our Windy City Times and the Reader have always been free papers. So when people were afraid of the internet in the 80s, was it the 80s? No, the 90s. The mid-90s, Tribune and all those papers, they were all afraid of it because it was free. We were like, oh my God, we have more content than we could ever put in print. This is great. We can put all this extra content online, right? So we were online in 94 or something with our first website. And some of that stuff is still on there in ways that we don't even know how to find. So when Barack Obama was running for president, we had reported in 1996 that Obama was for marriage equality because he was. He was actually for marriage equality on a survey in our newspaper. Yeah. He had said, I support marriage equality, or whatever the phrase was. And so some enterprising reporter had dug through our deep archives that we didn't even have linked because we had changed websites in the meantime. And they found this story. So then I was able to I knew where to go, and I found the original documents. Mm-hmm. And I wrote a book around it because we had all these documents from Obama in the mid-90s where he had changed, he didn't reverse his position. He went 360 back to his original position once it was more politically palatable. Mm.
And I would say, I mean, you were talking to me beforehand about how you wanted to work with other communities in other minority media groups. Can you talk a little bit more about that project that you're working on?
So 2 different parallel things we're doing at the Reader, and that's why I'm really grateful to be at the Reader. One is with traditional legacy media in Chicago. We are partnering with 7 other legacy brands, some of them 120 years old, some 80 years old, some 50 years old, and then Windy City Times as well, and a couple newer ones. Southside Weekly, Korea Times, La Raza, Chicago Crusader, Streetwise, Hyde Park Herald, and Windy City Times. So the 8 of us next week are launching a media, Reader is launching Reader Media Group, and we're having our sales team work for these other papers on a pilot. We're not going to distract our team too much from the Reader because that's our core, but we also know there's some clients, our combined print run is 304,000 copies. Hmm. So I have 50,000, 55,000 at the Reader. That may not get me a meeting, but 300,000 print copies, that can get us a meeting. Yeah. And also we all have digital, some better than others. Some don't have any social media presence, which is shocking to me. So we hope to maybe lift them up into the internet age. And so that's a pilot. We're going to try it for a few months to see if there's any movement there. And then the other one is we're going to try to organize all independent media in Chicago, whether they're online only or print or whatever, as long as they're independently owned, and try to create a network that maybe can do an annual fundraiser for all independent media in Chicago. And this is where we'd love to partner with Google, because it would be about teaching what the legacy of this media is and why these stories are important by people about their own communities, right, which is so different than looking top down or parachuting in for a crime story. And then working together, because then I can find out more about La Raza or Korea Times or other papers, and I may want to support them. I may want to give $5 a year to this paper, $10 to this. And I think that if we do that, we educate people why it's important, and we give them opportunity to help, that we could really help the landscape of community and ethnic media in Chicago.
That's awesome.
That I hope through a foundation to work, not that. So the first one is more of on a for-profit media side. The second is for-profit, nonprofit, mission-driven, whatever your media is like, you can participate in that.
Awesome. Okay, let's move on to the next question, make sure we get all of them. How do you see the role served by gayborhoods in incubating community voices, business, and activism now versus in the early 90s?
Chicago's gayborhood has been surprisingly sustainable compared to other cities. Mm-hmm. Part of that is because in the 80s, prior to the 80s, most of gay bars were owned by the mafia. Gay people didn't own a lot of the real estate or the institutions of the community. But starting in the 80s and late 70s, gay people started owning their own stuff, and including the businesses and the bars. So yeah, on Halsted Street, gay bars started to be owned by gay people. And some of those, like Sidetrack, have sustained, and Roscoe's and a few others. So that helped the stability of Boys Town. And then over time, other things have helped lead to that, including the opening of the center in Halsted, the Gay Senior Center, and the Legacy Project. If you haven't seen the Legacy Project, along Halsted, the pylons, the rainbow pylons that you see, there are plaques there. A man named Victor Salvo started that a few years ago, and he's a phenomenal visionary activist because everybody told him no. And he had this in his mind for many years, and he finally was able to get approval, and now it's historic. The city of Chicago this year is making it historical, like they're designated historic markers. And it's a phenomenal project. It also lives online of international LGBT pioneers. It's all posthumous, so there's no fighting among the living. But really incredible stories that they tell in the plaques as well as online. So that has really cemented it as this tourism destination as well as for people that live here. But one thing has always been true is that LGBT people have lived in every single neighborhood of Chicago and the suburbs forever. And having that center point often becomes the pivoting to something else. So most gay people never have lived in Boys Town because they wouldn't have fit. And secondly, as they have children or as they have jobs in the suburbs or whatever, they naturally have migrated out to other areas, especially moving north along the city line, the lakefront. But there's always been LGBT people in Beverly and Hyde Park and Oak Park and Naperville and wherever it is. But the center point helps because it gives you clout. It gives you voting clout. It gives you economic clout. And it's a great starting off point for people. But that absolutely is something you can't solely rely on. In some cities, their gay community has died out in many ways because they haven't seen that as one center point, but not the only place that we gather and do things.
Awesome. That's interesting. I had no idea that the bars were initially owned by the mafia.
Yep. That's crazy. Absolutely. And that's because liquor licenses were even harder to get. And the mafia would pay off the cops. They would pay off the liquor commission. Any gay people that worked were usually the sacrificial lambs when there were bar raids. Mm-hmm. There's a guy named Jim Flint who owns the Baton Show Lounge. I did a biography of him, Jim Flint, the boy from Peoria. It talks all about he was arrested over 50 times in bar raids.
Wow.
Yeah, crazy. He's still with us. Go to his bar. Hey. He's got great stories to tell.
After work today, you guys. Next question. Who and or what has been your biggest inspiration in your life in terms of advocacy and why?
My mother, who passed away 22 years ago. She was a journalist ahead of her time. She was everything ahead of her time. She was more bold and fearless than me. She would travel around the world. She interviewed Fidel Castro in the mountains of Cuba in the late 50s before he was elected, self-appointed, whatever, as head of Cuba, and visited Cuba multiple times after, illegally, through Canada and through church monitoring groups. And she'd go to Haiti to monitor elections. She'd go to South Africa for the first free elections to monitor them. She visited Tiananmen Square before and after she just was, I thought she was a spy. She said she was a journalist. I've requested her FBI records. They say there are none. But she was amazing, and she was always running. At my thing last week, I said my mother was an enigma, and if I couldn't write an accurate life story of hers because I don't know what her motivations were. I don't know where it came from, but I do know that she was a great inspiration for me, knowing that my stepfather worked at the Tribune, my mother worked at the Chicago Defender. I knew I'd be more likely to work and follow in her footsteps in independent media than I would have ever fit in at the Tribune. So I was lucky I had that path for me that she had paved and many other women journalists before her paved.
That's awesome. I think at this time, we have about 9 minutes left. We can open it up to questions in the audience. You guys can just go up to the mic and ask whatever you want. It's an open book. Hello.
Hi. Thanks so much for coming. I sense that you have so much experience in history that I lack. And I'm curious your thoughts on kind of the current, tying your experience here in Chicago in the past and up to present to what's currently happening politically, and how those of us that weren't around in the 80s being politically active, because I was just getting born, what everything, is it kind of one of those everything that's old is new again, or Just I'd love some insight in how we can kind of get through the current political period.
It's really
Thank you.
bad right now, not for everybody. And so, you know, I think we can learn a lot from the 1980s. And that is to pick a lane or two, because we individually as Chicagoans, we can't do everything. We can't even solve every problem in our own city, much less the world. But if you're doing something, you're part of that. So like I said, in the 80s, not everybody could be a ACT UP protester. Not everybody could meet with pharmaceutical companies to negotiate pricing. Not everybody could serve a meal to somebody who's dying, or walk their dog, or clean their cat box, right? But you could do one of those things, right? And pick one of those things. And now that's the same thing. Not everybody's meant to be fighting in the streets. Not everybody can, for a variety of reasons. Not everybody can give money, but they can give time. They can give sustenance to people who are hurting in ways that you can. So pick something, and if that burns you out, go to another thing, right? Because one of the hardest things for me to watch was when people would burn out because they tried too many things at once. And there are a lot of purist activists out there that can be very draining on who you are, right? Like, though I'm a purist in many ways in my politics for myself, but I don't hold other people to that same level because it's impossible. And I'm very fortunate as a white cisgender female in Chicago right now compared to a lot of other people here. So if some individual personality conflict is there, move along, move around. Don't let a person be your barrier to caring and doing something, because that is the hardest thing to get around. You know, familial homophobia and internal conflicts within the LGBT community are some of the hardest things to get over. I tell you personally that the burning by other people is a lot hotter than Trump saying some crap about me, right? So just know there are so many options now to having an effective form of activism or support, and on immigrant rights and on homeless issues. In Chicago has amazing people and organizations. Like, there's no, I don't want to say excuse because that's blaming, but there are so many options to find where you fit in. Interview like it's for a job. Your volunteer work should be treated like a job, in that you want to find the right fit for that so that you can sustain over a couple year period of time. So that would be my main thing, because I've seen a lot of people not figure out a way to pace themselves. Not that I'm kind of preaching, I should be preaching myself, because I should have hit burnout a long time ago, but somehow I'm motivated because of the people, the good people, and I leave aside the people that want to bring you down for their own internal strife. You know, internal homophobia is a damaging thing, and it's not an easy thing to get out of, but people are, and like people say, it's like crabbing. You pull everybody down with you, and so go to another tank.
Hello. As a nearly 30-year reader of the Reader here, I don't know when it actually happened, but at one time, the Chicago Reader was clearly the most independent paper in the city. And both sides were treated fairly. And I think that, and that's why, like, when the John Burge, came out, I think it was universally condemned on both sides. And people were angry. And I think now it seems like the Reader has I don't want to say, they have a point of view, way more so than they did originally. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Sure. And I'm not on the editorial side at the Reader, but I certainly agree with you. But I do think they had that point of view before. I think other things have changed around them to make it seem possibly more liberal, progressive than it might have looked 20, 30 years ago. I think that may be more the case, because I was a reader of it as well. So when I took over on October 1st as publisher, 2 new owners took over as well. So they bought it away from the Chicago Sun-Times. For about 7 years, they were corporate owned. Chicago Sun-Times, and then prior to that, some others. The original founders had sold it to a corporation and another corporation. So it has changed hands so many times over the years that there's a little bit of PTSD among the staff that I'm dealing with. And we hired 2 new editors-in-chief, co-editors-in-chief, who are outside of the reader to kind of bring it, we hope, back to a little more curated culture in politics, and multiple points of view. And I don't necessarily, I'm not saying we're going to have a conservative right-wing writer. That's not going to happen at the reader. The owners are very progressive liberal. But having more points of view within that spectrum, because a white north side progressive is different than an African American south side perspective and a Latino immigrant's perspective, whatever. So having more voices and more wide-ranging opinions. We actually started an opinions column back. But I do feel like if you're looking for it for a moderate to right perspective, you probably won't get that in the reader. But you will get, I think you get pretty fair. Even Ben Jarafsky, who's, super legendary reader person. We have a podcast with him 4 days a week. He will have on opposition on his podcast all the time. And his columns try to be as inclusive of all various aspects of the spectrum of views on an issue than he can. So I do think that's a goal when there is multiple sides to a story. We just did a huge months-long investigation on evictions in Chicago. We certainly allowed all the people we were attacking in the story to have all their points of view. And it was vetted by lawyers to make sure that we were being as fair as the documents, witnessed for us to write. So the goal is not to be, really attacking without fact or having only one version of what a progressive might be.
Awesome. Do we have any more questions? Awesome. This will be our last question.
One of the things that I've noticed in the past 15 years is the idea of community has changed, both as LGBTQ rights have become more normalized and accepted and as digital technology has advanced. Do you worry at all about the community disappearing, the community, whatever that is, and what that means for all of us as individuals?
I do have a distorted perspective on it, and I agree with you that there's this potential, but I've never seen it as one community, even in '84, right? So I knew that if I wanted to get this perspective on the community, I needed to go to, Englewood or Oak Park or Fox Valley for the suburban gays, right? That they never really all agreed on anything. Even marriage equality was controversial as an issue. So I worry we lose our clout and our power when we fight so much internally and when we don't have a lot of things that coalesce us into the ability to show up for one another. And I do think once marriage equality hit in Canada, for example, a lot of the LGBT movement just disappeared. And we saw that happen. And so people in Chicago, when I did that march, my 13 co-chairs, only one of them cared about marriage. I said, we need to get marriage out of the way so we can focus on the next issue. And I promised them we would do that. So within 5 months after that march, we had that huge homeless youth summit. And for the last 5 years have been activating things from that summit. And in fact, Lori Lightfoot's transition report from her team includes some of our recommendations. And J.B. Pritzker's at the state level has appointed people that were part of our conference. So we've infiltrated the state and local and even Cook County. And sometimes you get absorbed into that mainstream in a way. So now we have gay people working for Pritzker and Lightfoot and trans people working, but so you kind of lose your kind of ability to activate quickly. But assimilation has benefits and negatives. So I think we just have to make sure we're ready and able to fight back and agree on some things when we disagree on a lot of things. Like, where can we find our common denominators with other communities? And I think we've done a decent job on that. I think a lot of LGBT people have shown up at the anti-gun events, at the women's rallies, at the immigrants things, as openly LGBT people. So there are more LGBT activists today, probably by 20-fold, than there were 35 years ago when I started, by maybe 100-fold. So that's why I'm not worried. We're just in different ways activating because marriage is done. So now I'm going to fight on immigration because that's something I care about now, or homelessness or whatever. So I do think the communication tools are critical to make sure we are nimble and ready. So people do need to not, let these talents rust away, because we're going to keep needing them. Women can tell you that have been fighting for choice for 100 years, that it's never a given that what that progress isn't going to be pulled right out from under us.
Well, thank you, Tracy. This is kicking off our Pride Month here at Google. We will be sending you guys so many emails with all the different events that we have in June, so make sure to not archive them or delete them.
Sunday, June 23rd, Chicago Reader Block Party in Bridgeport. We're bringing Pride to the South Side, 1 to 9 p.m. We'll get information to Juan and everybody. So.
Yeah, so thank you, Tracy. Thanks for coming, and
Yep.
thanks, everyone.